Snow whipped against the fuselage of the cargo plane as it sat on the icy tarmac of Fairbanks International Airport. The low hum of the generator mixed with the groan of metal contracting in the freezing air. Inside the hangar, a few mechanics huddled around toolboxes, their breaths clouding like fog in the dim light. Everyone knew the schedule. Everyone knew the routine. But no one knew Captain Alina Mercer. Alina walked along the line of waiting aircraft, her boots crunching in the snow. Her flight jacket, worn to a muted green-gray, flapped slightly in the wind. She tugged the collar up and pulled her cap down over her eyes. The cold was nothing to her. She'd flown in harsher conditions than this, over enemy territory, dodging missiles and storms that could rip planes apart in seconds. Yet today, she was just a cargo pilot, a faceless name on the manifest, carrying boxes of supplies to towns no one outside Alaska cared about. Her plane, a bulky C-130 Hercules, looked unassuming, but it had carried more lives than most people ever saved in their lifetimes. Emergency medical supplies, evacuees from frozen villages, injured miners, disaster relief packages. Every item inside was a lifeline, and Alina carried them like sacred cargo. The sheer weight of responsibility didn't intimidate her, it sharpened her focus. Inside the cockpit, she ran her fingers over the familiar controls, checking every dial, every switch. The cabin smelled faintly of engine oil, antiseptic, and the lingering warmth of 1,000 flights. She had been flying cargo for almost 7 years, yet she still approached each mission as if it were her first. Discipline was her religion, precision her mantra. Today she was flying to a remote town near the Brooks Range. A medical emergency had come in. The local clinic had run out of essential antibiotics, and a blizzard threatened to cut off all road access. Her passengers were not soldiers or VIPs, but families, sick children, elderly patients, and she would get them there. That was all that mattered. Alina's co-pilot, a young man named Derek Willis, was quietly reviewing the flight plan. He was competent but inexperienced in conditions like these. He watched her closely, sensing her aura, a quiet command that demanded respect without words. He'd heard rumors about her, whispers that she wasn't just any pilot, but she never talked about her past. "Flight plan is clear," Derek said, breaking the silence. "Weather looks manageable for now." Alina didn't respond. Her eyes were on the horizon where low-hanging clouds stretched like a gray blanket over the snow-draped mountains. There was always a risk, always, but that risk didn't scare her. Fear was a tool for the weak, a distraction she had long since discarded. As they taxied toward the runway, Alina noticed 2 figures standing near the hangar entrance. They were dressed in flight suits with F-22 patches, their posture casual but deliberate. She barely registered them. Visitors came and went all the time. They didn't belong to her world. Once in the air, the plane roared as it lifted, the engines cutting through the frozen wind like knives. Alina's hands were steady on the yoke, her eyes scanning the instruments and the horizon simultaneously. Below, the snowy wilderness stretched endlessly, a frozen ocean of white, dotted with tiny towns barely visible from this height. Every mile carried lives. Every second mattered. Halfway to the destination, turbulence hit. The C-130 shuddered violently as if protesting the storm. Derek gripped his seat, eyes wide. Alina's calm voice cut through the chaos. "Relax, trust the plane, trust me." Her tone was flat, almost emotionless, but there was an undeniable authority in it. Derek swallowed hard and nodded, knowing better than to argue. Outside, sheets of ice began to form on the wings. The instruments flickered under the strain, but she adjusted her speed and angle with uncanny precision. It was during this moment that the radio crackled unexpectedly. A calm, professional voice spoke, but with an edge of disbelief. "Mercer, is that you?" Alina froze mid-turn. The voice was unfamiliar yet oddly familiar, like a ghost from a life she had buried. She glanced at Derek, who had paled. The name Mercer in this voice carried weight beyond a simple introduction. "Identify yourself," Alina replied evenly, masking the sudden tension in her chest. There was a pause, then a quieter voice. "Valkyrie, it's been years." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Valkyrie, her old call sign, something she hadn't used in over a decade. Memories flashed unbidden. The roar of jet engines at Mach speeds, the smell of jet fuel mixed with ozone, the adrenaline of dogfights over classified zones, the missions no one would ever know about. She had erased that life for a reason. She gritted her teeth and returned to her instruments, focusing on the mission in front of her. But now, there was a shadow on this flight, a shadow from the past she had never intended to confront. The F-22 pilots weren't just curious, they were hunters, and they had recognized a predator hidden in plain sight. The thought alone sent a chill through her, not from fear, but from the reminder that no one ever truly disappears. Someone always remembers. Minutes later, the storm intensified. Visibility dropped to near zero. Snow battered the windshield like tiny fists. Derek's hands were sweating, but Alina were steady. She adjusted the flaps, banked the plane, and threaded a path through jagged mountain ridges, relying on a mixture of skill, intuition, and memory. As they approached the landing zone, the radio crackled again. This time, it was the local emergency coordinator. "Captain Mercer, conditions are worsening. You may have to abort. Visibility is almost gone." She didn't hesitate. "No, we land. Lives depend on it. Hold on." The plane descended, shaking violently as ice built up on the wings. Every nerve in her body screamed caution, but experience had taught her a higher truth. Hesitation kills. She pushed forward, landing gear locked, flaps extended, the nose of the C-130 dipping perilously close to the runway markers buried under snow. Finally, with a shuddering crash, the plane touched down. Snow exploded around the landing strip as engines roared in defiance. Derek exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Alina didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply shut down the engines and removed her gloves, staring out into the storm that had threatened lives moments before. Inside the cargo hold, families emerged, teeth chattering, eyes wide with relief. Children clutched blankets, parents wrapped arms protectively around them. She had saved them. 300 souls, alive because she had flown when others wouldn't. Yet as she climbed down the ladder, the wind howling around her, she noticed the two F-22 pilots standing near the hangar, watching her with something she hadn't expected: recognition. Not curiosity, not admiration, but a silent acknowledgement that she was not who she appeared to be. For the first time in years, Alina Mercer felt the past brush against the edges of her carefully constructed life. And she knew, deep down, that the quiet days of cargo flights and isolated towns were over. Something was coming, something she could not yet see, but that would change everything. The snow fell harder. The engines cooled. The lives she saved were safe, but someone somewhere had just remembered Valkyrie. The hangar was quiet, except for the echo of snow crunching under boots and the faint hum of distant generators. Outside, the storm raged, blotting out the world in white. Inside, two men in sleek F-22 flight suits lingered near the cargo bay, their eyes fixed on Alina Mercer. They weren't here to inspect planes. They weren't tourists. They were hunters, though neither of them would admit it yet, and Alina was the prey they had unexpectedly rediscovered. Alina climbed down the ladder, her boots hitting the icy tarmac with a firm, controlled thud. She ignored the pilots, but the air around them felt charged, as if the storm itself had hushed in anticipation. Her eyes scanned the perimeter, watching the evacuated families move toward waiting vehicles, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. She always worked for them. Always. But today, she realized she was being measured in ways that had nothing to do with cargo flights. One of the pilots approached, his steps deliberate, almost hesitant. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of precision in movement that betrayed years of combat training. His face was partially shadowed by the hood of his jacket, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, were impossible to ignore. "Captain Mercer," he asked, his voice calm, professional, yet carrying the weight of disbelief. Alina froze for just a heartbeat, then tilted her chin up. Yes, and you are. The other pilot stepped forward, shorter but no less imposing. His gaze held hers like a predator assessing prey that had slipped through his grasp before. You flew under the call sign Valkyrie, didn't you? The name hit her like a bolt of lightning. Valkyrie. A name she hadn't uttered in over a decade. A name tied to things she had buried deep, missions that were classified, victories that were dangerous to admit, moments that had cost her more than medals or recognition. For a moment, Alina's usual calm faltered, but she caught herself immediately. I don't use call signs anymore, she said flatly, walking past them toward the nearest exit. She felt their gaze cling to her back like a shadow. She could feel the questions, the curiosity, the recognition that cut deeper than cold steel. The tall pilot called after her. You don't get to hide from this. Valkyrie, we thought you were gone. Alina stopped, turned just slightly enough for him to see the hard edge in her eyes. Gone, maybe, but never forgotten, I suppose. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of experience. She had been trained to confront life-threatening situations, not small talk from people who thought they understood her history. Derek, her co-pilot, hovered nearby, confusion and concern etched across his face. Captain, what's going on? Who are they? Alina didn't answer. She never did when it involved her past. But the storm outside seemed to press against her like a reminder. Valkyrie had never truly left. The tall pilot, arms crossed, finally spoke again, softer this time. We saw your name on the flight plan. Thought it was a coincidence, but it is. You're Valkyrie, the Valkyrie. Her heart skipped, not in fear, but in recognition of how quickly the past had caught up. It was a life she had tried to escape, a shadow she had buried under cargo logs and emergency missions. And yet here it was, staring her in the face. You don't understand, she said finally, her voice steadier now like ice. That name, that life, it doesn't exist anymore. Not for me. Not in this world. The shorter pilot shook his head slowly. It does exist, and it matters, more than you think. We didn't come here for small talk, Captain. We came because you're the only one who, he paused, swallowed hard, then continued, the only one who could have handled what just happened in that storm, and we know what you're capable of. Alina's jaw tightened. She wanted to ignore them, wanted to close the chapter she had spent years keeping locked. But their eyes told a story she couldn't unsee, an understanding, a shared respect for skill, for instinct, for sheer survival. They had seen the name Valkyrie and immediately understood that it wasn't just a call sign, it was a legacy. The storm outside intensified, snow whipping sideways, visibility dropping to a few feet. The sound of wind howling through the hangar echoed like distant gunfire, reminding her of battles fought in skis where no civilian had ever been allowed. And in that storm, a storm more metaphorical than meteorological, Alina felt the weight of recognition pressing down. You don't know what you're asking for, she said finally, her tone low, dangerous. That life, it ended. You have no idea what it cost me, what I lost, what I had to leave behind. The tall pilot stepped closer, undeterred. We know, or at least we know enough to recognize a pilot who can do the impossible. That's why we're here. You saved lives today, hundreds by all accounts, and you did it alone. But there's more out there, things that need Valkyrie again, things only you can do. Derek glanced at Alina, his confusion deepening. Captain, what is he talking about? Alina's eyes flicked toward the snowstorm outside, then back at the two pilots. For a long moment she said nothing. Memories surged, dogfights at Mach speeds, missions so secret that their existence had never been acknowledged, moments when she had flown closer to death than most could imagine. She had walked away from all of it. She had erased herself. And yet the recognition, the acknowledgement from these pilots was undeniable. She had left, but the world had not forgotten Valkyrie. I walked away for a reason, she said finally, her voice calm but resolute. I don't do that life anymore. I fly cargo. I save people who can't save themselves. That's enough." The shorter pilot's lips pressed into a thin line. "We know, but today we saw something else. You didn't just save lives, you commanded a storm, flew where no one else could, made decisions that most of us couldn't. That's not just skill. That's Valkyrie. And people like Valkyrie don't stay buried forever." Alina's hands clenched, but she remained composed. She had lived her life under pressure, under scrutiny, under impossible circumstances. She had survived things most would call death. And yet, the sudden spotlight of recognition, after years of anonymity, was disarming in a way she hadn't anticipated. She glanced at Derek. "Stay out of this, trust me." Derek swallowed but nodded. He didn't fully understand, but he trusted her implicitly. He had learned quickly that Captain Mercer's instincts were infallible. The taller pilot, sensing he might be losing her, made one last attempt. "Valkyrie, I'm not here to pull you back into a past you don't want, but know this, what you just did today wasn't ordinary. People are watching and people need you. If you ever reconsider—" His voice trailed off, leaving the statement open-ended, almost like a challenge. Alina turned away, walking toward the plane that had carried 300 lives through the storm. The F-22 pilots watched her go, silently acknowledging that the woman before them was no longer just a cargo pilot. She was a force of nature, the same Valkyrie they had once trained alongside, and perhaps the only pilot capable of confronting the challenges that lay ahead. Inside the cockpit, Alina sat in silence, her hands gripping the controls. The radio crackled again, and though no one was on the other end, the words lingered in her mind. Valkyrie, recognition, legacy, responsibility. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the plane, a storm of a different kind was building. A storm that carried the weight of a past that refused to stay buried, and a future that might demand everything she had tried to leave behind. As the engines warmed, ready for the next mission, Alina Mercer stared out into the blizzard, knowing that today was not the end of the storm. It was only the beginning. Somewhere in the swirling white chaos, Valkyrie had returned, not because she wanted to, but because the world had remembered her. And that realization sent a chill colder than the Alaskan wind straight through her. Alina Mercer had tried for years to bury her past beneath cargo manifests and frozen runways, but some ghosts refused to stay buried. The moment the words Valkyrie left the F-22 pilots' mouths, the memories surged back, relentless and vivid, like jet engines roaring over her skull. She remembered the first time she set foot in Top Gun, the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School. She had been 19, fresh out of flight school, eager, defiant, and dangerous. Everyone had underestimated her, too young, too small, too reckless, too brilliant. She didn't care. All that mattered was the sky and the challenge of dominating it. Her call sign, Valkyrie, had been given after the first mock dogfight in which she outmaneuvered a seasoned instructor who had never lost a single engagement. She had looped, rolled, and spun her F-14 through maneuvers so unconventional that the instructor's jaw had dropped. Valkyrie, they called her, after the mythical Norse warrior women, a fitting name for someone who seemed untouchable, unstoppable. Years later, during classified operations, her skill became a double-edged sword. Missions that required precision, daring, and nerve found her at the center. She had flown in hostile skis over undisclosed locations, where detection meant death and failure was unthinkable. Her fingers had gripped the throttle as missiles screamed past, as wingmen vanished into the clouds, and she had survived by instinct alone. She had flown faster, smarter, and more ruthlessly than anyone else in her squadron. But the mission that changed everything was the one no one would ever write about. The details remained classified, buried in government vaults and unspoken in every military briefing. Alina had been leading a small formation tasked with escorting a critical payload across enemy airspace. Radar contacts appeared suddenly, 6 enemy interceptors converging on their position. Standard protocol dictated a retreat and call for support. But retreat meant leaving her wingman exposed. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, her closest ally, had trusted her with his life more times than she could count. The thought of leaving him behind, of letting him die because of rules she didn't agree with, was unthinkable. Alina made the call to break formation and engage. She spun her aircraft into the interceptors, weaving impossibly tight loops, dodging missiles, and using every trick she had mastered at Top Gun. One by one, enemy fighters were neutralized, but her own aircraft took damage. Warning lights flashed. Alarms screamed. Her wingman was safe, but they had attracted attention. Too much attention. The debriefing that followed was brutal. Orders had been broken. Protocol had been ignored. She had saved lives, yes, but in the eyes of her superiors, she had also endangered a mission critical to national security. Praise was whispered behind closed doors. Punishment was delivered publicly. "You have the skill to fly beyond anyone in this program," the commanding officer said, voice tight with tension. "But your recklessness, your willingness to put yourself and others at risk for instinct alone, it cannot continue." She was grounded. Valkyrie, the top pilot in her class, was stripped of combat privileges. Awards were quietly issued, but medals could not undo the message. She was too dangerous, too brilliant, too independent. The humiliation had burned, but it had not broken her. She had left the military with her head held high, carrying a record of success no one could officially acknowledge. She had walked away from the skis she loved, from the planes that had become extensions of herself, from the missions that had defined her. She had walked away from Valkyrie. And then, for years, she had disappeared. Civilian life offered anonymity, and Alaska offered isolation. She became a cargo pilot, ferrying life-saving supplies through storms that grounded other pilots, rescuing people whose names would never be printed in newspapers. In the frozen wilderness, the echoes of her past were muffled by howling winds and blizzards. She was no longer Valkyrie, at least, not to anyone who mattered. Until now. The F-22 pilot's recognition had cracked the armor she had built around herself. She felt it in the pit of her stomach. The truth she had buried so deeply was resurfacing. She remembered her first encounter with those pilots years ago, in a classified briefing for a joint exercise. They had been the elite of the elite, the new blood of air superiority, testing her skills against theirs in simulated combat. She had outmaneuvered them at every turn, leaving them both frustrated and awed. She had watched them struggle to accept defeat at the hands of someone they considered retired. And yet, despite her skill, she had never wanted recognition. Top Gun was a proving ground, not a stage for ego. Her victories had been silent, her defeats invisible, her brilliance unrecorded in any public ledger. She had flown not for glory, but because it was the only language she spoke. Now standing on the tarmac in Fairbanks, Valkyrie's past collided with Alina Mercer's present. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her, a maelstrom of memory, skill, regret, and the sharp edge of anticipation. She had survived everything the world had thrown at her, but recognition from these pilots was different. It was not a threat in the conventional sense. It was a reminder that the world had not forgotten, and that the choices she had made, and the consequences she had evaded, were waiting. Her eyes flicked back to Derek, still watching nervously. "Keep your head down," she whispered, though her voice betrayed the tension coiling within her. "This is not for you." The taller F-22 pilot, sensing her reluctance, pressed. "You don't understand. Valkyrie, the world doesn't stay quiet forever. You may have hidden, but people remember. They need pilots like you. People like you don't vanish, they wait. And today, they saw what you're capable of." Alina's jaw tightened. She knew they were right, though she refused to admit it aloud. Saving lives in Alaska was different from engaging in international crises, or missions that involved political and military stakes far higher than anything civilian cargo could touch. Her hands had kept planes in the air under impossible conditions. Yes, but her mind remembered the pressure of decisions that could ignite wars. And yet the thrill, the call of the sky, the razor-sharp clarity of life-and-death combat still lingered. It haunted her like a shadow she could never shake. Valkyrie had not truly left. She had simply been waiting for a moment when she might be needed again, or when someone would force her hand. The pilot stepped back, silently acknowledging that the confrontation was over for now. They had left the challenge open-ended, like a test only Valkyrie could pass, and she had passed it silently, with no one the wiser except herself. Elena Mercer looked at the horizon, where gray clouds merged with snow, creating a world both hostile and beautiful. Memories of dogfights, near misses, and impossible missions flashed across her mind. Each one reminded her that the quiet cargo flights of today were a fragile shield against a past that would always seek her out. She pressed her hands to the cold metal of the C-130, grounding herself in the present, in the lives she was actively saving. 300 souls were safe today because of her skill, but the acknowledgement from the pilots reminded her of a truth she had tried to escape. Skill like hers could never remain hidden forever. And somewhere, out in the vast, frozen expanse of the world, Valkyrie waited, always waiting. The snowstorm continued to rage, a relentless force of nature. But inside Elena, a different storm had begun, one of anticipation, unease, and an undeniable pull toward the life she thought she had left behind. She had buried Valkyrie deep, but recognition had unearthed her. And deep down, she knew that once Valkyrie re-emerged, nothing would ever be the same. Elena Mercer had spent nearly a decade hiding in plain sight. Alaska's frozen wilderness became her refuge, a place where no one knew Valkyrie, where she could slip into anonymity behind a cargo plane's cockpit window. The air was thin, the wind relentless, but the quiet was comforting. She thought it would be enough to bury the past. She thought she could outrun it. But the past doesn't stay buried. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it finds you in the most unlikely places. After her final Top Gun mission, the one that changed everything, she had returned to base with her wings heavy with accomplishment and suspicion. Classified debriefs were held behind closed doors. Reports were filed under codes she couldn't even read. Officers praised her skill in hushed tones, but her face remained carefully neutral. "You went too far," one senior officer said finally, a man whose gray eyes had seen more than they should have. "You saved lives, yes, but you also violated orders. You exposed sensitive intel. You took risks we cannot afford to sanction publicly. You are too valuable and too dangerous." Elena's jaw tightened. "I saved him. I saved everyone. What else matters?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "It matters because it could have escalated beyond control, because lives, not just yours or your wingman's, could have been lost in ways the public will never understand. You're brilliant, yes, but brilliance isn't a free pass." She understood. She had always understood. Orders were orders. Protocols existed for a reason. And yet sometimes orders were wrong. Sometimes following them meant letting someone die. Sometimes the right choice was the one that left you grounded, silenced, and erased. They offered medals quietly. A commendation here, a private nod there. But there would be no ceremony, no recognition in public, no glory. And more importantly, there would be no further combat flights for Elena Mercer. Valkyrie, the pilot who had outmaneuvered every expectation, was to vanish. She left the Air Force that week. She resigned quietly, packing up her belongings, filing the necessary paperwork, and disappearing from the radar. No fanfare, no interviews, just a transfer of her skills to civilian life, where she could continue to make a difference without being scrutinized or controlled. Alaska was her choice. Remote towns, medevac flights, cargo deliveries. No one asked for her past, no one questioned her motives. She had traded high-speed interceptors for heavy-laden C-130s, adrenaline for purpose, recognition for quiet fulfillment. For years it worked. She existed in a world of survival and service, where her skills mattered in ways the public would never know. And yet the memories never left. At night she remembered the roar of engines in combat. She remembered the heat of missiles passing too close. She remembered faces, wingmen she could not save, enemies she had bested, decisions made in split seconds that had altered lives. These memories were her private gallery, painted in adrenaline and fear. She never spoke of them. She never allowed anyone to see. But that night in Fairbanks, as the F-22 pilots, recognition lingered in the air, those memories surfaced with relentless force. Valkyrie had been called out, whether she liked it or not. The past was no longer content to remain hidden behind the cockpit of a civilian cargo plane. She remembered the moment she realized she couldn't go back, not to the Air Force, not to combat, not to the life she had loved and lost. It was during a debrief after a high-stakes mission, one of those secret operations that would never appear in any public record. She had been praised but simultaneously warned. Her instincts were too sharp, her reflexes too fast, her judgments too independent. Commanders were afraid she would act on impulse, even if that impulse saved lives. "You're too good," a colonel had said quietly, looking directly at her. "Too dangerous. You follow orders when it suits you, but when instinct calls, you take risks the rest of us can't. You could turn a mission from success to disaster in a heartbeat, even unintentionally." Alina had clenched her fists under the table, nodding silently. They had never understood that her choices weren't impulsive, they were calculated. Every move, every maneuver had a logic that others could not grasp, and yet to them it was chaos. To them, she was a liability disguised as brilliance. The decision to leave wasn't easy. She had loved flying combat, the thrill, the danger, the precision, but the cost had become too high. The lives she had risked, the secrets she carried, the rules she had broken, it was too much to reconcile with duty and obedience. Leaving meant survival, not just for her, but for those who depended on her judgment. Alaska offered absolution. It offered a chance to use her skills without fear of retribution. Cargo flights became a lifeline not only for the communities she served, but for herself. Every successful mission was a quiet victory, a reaffirmation that she could still make a difference, even if no one knew her name. Yet the recognition by the F-22 pilots had cracked the veil she had built. Valkyrie was not gone. Valkyrie had never truly left. And for the first time in years, Alina felt the weight of that identity pressing against her carefully constructed life. She stood on the tarmac, staring into the snowstorm, remembering the faces of her wingmen, the thrill of maneuvers too dangerous to teach, the adrenaline that had been her constant companion. The life she had abandoned was calling her back, not with orders, not with threats, but with the undeniable force of what she was meant to be. Her hands clenched the cold metal of the C-130. She could feel the storm outside, the wind biting her cheeks, the engine's residual heat warming her gloves. But inside, a different storm brewed, one of anticipation, unease, and reluctant acknowledgement. Valkyrie had been forced into the shadows, but shadows could only hide you for so long. Recognition had a way of dragging even the most careful into the light. Alina looked at Derek, whose young eyes reflected confusion and concern. "Keep focused on the mission," she said quietly. "This isn't your fight, not yet." But she knew it was her fight, whether she wanted it or not. The past had a way of asserting itself, of reminding you that skill, instinct, and courage are never truly forgotten. Recognition was only the beginning. Later, as the plane hummed and the storm raged, she replayed the moment when she had walked away from the Air Force, the resignation papers, the last glance at her squadron, the sense of finality she had tried to convince herself existed. It had been the hardest choice of her life. She had loved flying combat, loved the camaraderie, loved the life of risk and precision, but she had survived by leaving it behind. And yet that survival came with its own cost: isolation, anonymity, and the constant reminder that she could never truly return. Valkyrie had been silenced, not for lack of skill, but because the world was not ready for someone who defied every expectation, who balanced instinct with brilliance, who acted when others hesitated. Alaska had been her sanctuary. Cargo flights were her redemption. But now, with the recognition of the F-22 pilots lingering in the cold night air, she realized the past was no longer content to stay buried. Valkyrie was awake, and the world, it seemed, was about to remember her. As the snow swirled, as engines cooled, and as townspeople went home safely thanks to her flight, Alina Mercer felt the first stirrings of a decision she had long avoided. Recognition had a way of demanding action, and Valkyrie did not ignore calls to the sky. For the first time in years, Alina realized that leaving combat had been only a temporary solution. The world had changed, and so had she. And though she had saved hundreds in the frozen wilderness, something told her that the true test of Valkyrie, of Alina Mercer, was only just beginning. The past she had buried had found her, and when Valkyrie rises, there are no second chances. The sky was an angry gray, streaked with thick bands of snow that fell sideways as if the wind had a personal vendetta against everything on the tarmac. The storm that had been threatening the Brooks Range for days had finally arrived, and it wasn't polite enough to wait for a plane to be ready. For the town of North Ridge, cut off from roads and communication, Alina Mercer's flight was the only lifeline. Inside the C-130, she strapped herself into the cockpit with mechanical precision. The plane vibrated under her hands, a living beast ready to challenge her skill. Co-pilot Derek Willis checked instruments and toggled switches, visibly nervous but trusting her implicitly. Alina didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. The calm authority radiating from her was enough to steady the nerves of anyone in the cockpit. Outside, the snow lashed against the fuselage like icy whips. The runway was barely visible, marked only by faint lights dimmed under layers of ice and snow. Air traffic control crackled over the radio, their voices tense, filled with warnings and half-orders. Visibility is below minimums. Recommend holding pattern until conditions improve. Alina's voice was flat but commanding. Negative, we're going in. Lives depend on this. Strap in. The engines roared to life, slicing through the snowstorm with a growl that echoed across the frozen landscape. The plane skidded along the icy runway before lifting into the gray void above. Wind gusts pushed the aircraft sideways, testing the limits of its massive wings. Ice began to form, crawling across the fuselage, clogging sensors and dulling instruments. "Engines are icing beyond limits," Derek said, his voice tight with anxiety. "We could lose power." Alina didn't flinch. She adjusted the throttle, banking the plane against the wind, threading a careful path between towering snowdrifts and unseen mountain ridges. Her eyes flicked between instruments and the murky horizon. Instinct took over, honed over years of life-or-death maneuvers in skis far more dangerous than this. Her mind drifted briefly to Valkyrie, the call sign she had buried deep in the past, the instincts she had tried to suppress in favor of quiet cargo flights. Every evasive maneuver she had ever learned, every split-second decision made in the chaos of combat, came rushing back. She was Valkyrie again, whether she liked it or not. "Hold her steady," she muttered, almost to herself, as the plane shuddered under a sudden gust. She tilted the nose slightly upward, fighting the storm's attempts to wrest control. Derek gripped his harness, white-knuckled, as alarms blared intermittently. Below them, the landscape vanished beneath a wall of white. GPS signals flickered. Radio contact was intermittent. The town they were racing toward existed only as a rough approximation in their instruments and her memory of the flight charts. If she hesitated now, if she doubted her skill, the plane could be buried in the snow before anyone knew what happened. "North Ridge is 12 miles ahead," Derek said, trying to maintain composure. "Visibility." "Not good enough," Alina interrupted, cutting him off. Her tone was sharp, urgent, commanding. "I see it." Derek blinked. He didn't see it. He couldn't, but she did. Training, instinct, experience, an entire lifetime of aerial combat condensed into seconds of clarity. Valkyrie's eyes were on the target and she was unwavering. Suddenly, a warning light flashed. One engine was faltering. Ice had built up faster than expected, threatening to seize the turbine. The plane lurched violently. Derek shouted over the roar of the storm, panic edging into his voice. Alina's hands were steady on the controls. Throttle forward, small adjustments, don't fight it, work with it. Her voice had the authority of someone who had survived impossible situations countless times. She banked, tilted, corrected, a dance with the storm that few living pilots could manage. The fuselage groaned, but she was already thinking ahead. Altitude, speed, wind currents, weight distribution, landing approach. Everything mattered. Everything could kill them if misjudged. The F-22 pilots, words from the hangar echoed in her mind. We saw your name on the flight plan, you're the only one who could have handled what just happened. They didn't know the half of it. She wasn't just flying a storm, she was surviving it, threading a path between life and death with Valkyrie's precision. Ahead, faint shapes emerged through the blizzard. The snow-covered town of North Ridge waited, isolated, vulnerable. The runway was barely discernible, a ribbon of light lost in the storm. Helicopters were grounded. Local pilots had refused to risk it. Only she could make it. Prepare for approach, she said, her voice steady, almost serene. Brace for turbulence. Eyes forward, hands ready. The descent was brutal. Snow slashed across the windshield. Winds howled through every gap in the fuselage. The aircraft shook as if it had its own heartbeat. Alina adjusted every control instinctively, feeling the plane's responses as extensions of her own body. Derek gripped his harness, eyes wide. We're gonna make it. Alina's eyes didn't leave the runway lights barely visible in the storm. We have to, she said simply. Minutes felt like hours. The plane dipped dangerously close to the frozen ground, buffeted by wind gusts that threatened to flip them. Ice had begun to clog sensors, leaving them flying by feel as much as by instrument. Her hands moved with machine-like precision, Valkyrie instincts kicking in full force. Every maneuver, every adjustment, was a silent conversation between pilot and aircraft. Finally, with a shudder that reverberated through the fuselage, the C-130 touched down. Snow exploded outward from the tires as the massive plane skidded along the icy runway, wings vibrating, engines screaming. Derek exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Alina held steady, guiding the plane to a halt, then killed the engines with deliberate care. Silence followed, only the storm's fury outside remained. 37 people stepped off the plane, blinking in disbelief, faces frozen but alive. Children clutched blankets. Parents wrapped arms protectively around them. Every person alive had been in her hands, and she had delivered them safely. 300 lives counted, at least for today, and for all of them she was a hero. Yet inside, Alina didn't feel relief. She felt the adrenaline fatting, leaving a quiet storm behind. Valkyrie had emerged again, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it had been necessary. Outside, 2 F-22 pilots stood watching, silent and awed. They had followed her flight over radio intercepts, tracking the impossible maneuvers she executed in real time. They had whispered among themselves, stunned. "She's still Valkyrie," one of them muttered. The realization struck Alina in that instant. The past was no longer hidden. Valkyrie had returned, even if she hadn't wanted to admit it. The skills she had buried under years of quiet service were alive, sharpened by necessity, and noticed by those who understood what it meant. Derek finally turned to her, pale but awed. "Captain, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Alina didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her focus was already shifting forward. The storm was still raging. More towns, more lives, more impossible missions awaited. Valkyrie didn't stop. Valkyrie didn't rest. And as the engines cooled and the snow continued to fall, Alina realized that today's storm was not the last. It had been a prelude, a test, a reminder of what she was capable of, and what the world would demand from her next. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her, relentless, unyielding, and alive. And for the first time in years, she felt the call of the sky not as a memory, but as an obligation. Valkyrie had returned, and the world was about to remember. The snowstorm had passed, leaving North Ridge encased in white silence. The air smelled of wet pine and burned fuel from the C-130's engines. The townspeople were safe, their evacuation complete, and the quiet was almost deafening after the chaos of the storm. But inside, Captain Alina Mercer felt no peace. Her hands still trembled slightly from the intensity of the flight. Valkyrie had flown again, in full force, and the adrenaline had left a residue she couldn't shake. She was packing her flight jacket into the cockpit when a low rumble behind her made her pause. A figure approached through the snow, a senior Air Force officer, one she had never seen in person but whose presence immediately carried authority. The man's steps were deliberate, unhurried, confident. He stopped at the rear of the plane, his eyes scanning her like someone evaluating more than just a pilot. They were studying a legacy. "Captain Mercer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Alina froze. She didn't turn immediately, her jaw tightening. She had expected recognition, attention even, from the F-22 pilots. She had not expected the Air Force itself to descend on a small Alaskan town in the aftermath of a storm. She finally turned, keeping her voice measured. "This is exactly my normal duty schedule," she said, almost dryly. "If you're here to inspect my aircraft." He shook his head. "Not here for that. I'm here because of what you did today." Alina's gaze narrowed. "I did what I had to do. People were in danger, that's all." He stepped closer, voice dropping slightly, almost confidentially. "You don't understand the full scope of what you just accomplished. Your flight, your maneuvers, the decisions you made, they were beyond the skill of any civilian pilot. They were military grade, top tier. And that's why I'm here." She stiffened, sensing where this was heading. "You mean you want me back?" The officer's eyes softened, but his tone remained serious. "Not necessarily back in combat, but we need your skills, Captain. The world is changing. Threats that were once theoretical are now real, and your abilities, your instincts, are needed. You are uniquely qualified, and not just by training, by experience." Alina exhaled slowly. She had heard this before, years ago, from commanders who had quietly praised her brilliance while simultaneously silencing it. The difference now was the setting. A frozen Alaskan tarmac, exhausted evacuees moving quietly in the background, and a man whose authority seemed absolute. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why risk coming here after all these years? You left me in the shadows. You silenced Valkyrie. You grounded me, told me I was too dangerous to exist in the air. And now, after all that, you want me back." The officer's eyes flicked to the town beyond the snow. "Because the mission you were grounded for, the one that ended your combat career, is no longer classified. It's public now. You didn't fail. You saved lives, but the consequences of your decisions were too explosive to acknowledge at the time. And now, the world needs someone who can make the same decisions with the same precision, without hesitation." Alina felt a chill beyond the Alaskan cold. The mission he referenced, the one she had buried, erased from memory, locked away, was a reminder of everything she had lost: glory, comrades, purpose, freedom. She had walked away from it all to protect herself and others. And yet here it was, the past demanding attention again. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly with frustration. "I walked away for a reason. I left combat, I left the Air Force, I left Valkyrie because I couldn't survive it without losing everything. I can't go back. I won't." The officer shook his head. "It's not about going back. It's about applying what you know in a new way. What you just did today, saving those civilians, proves it. You didn't just react. You predicted, adapted, executed. You use skills that are rare even among elite military pilots. And there are situations coming, situations that will require exactly that kind of judgment." Alina looked at him, her eyes hard, masking the turmoil beneath. Her mind raced. She had spent years living a quiet life, helping people in her own way, flying low-profile missions that no one would ever celebrate. And now, after years of peace, the Air Force was calling. They were calling Valkyrie. "You want me to fight again," she said finally, voice low, almost bitter. "To risk everything I left behind. To step back into a world that tried to control me, to silence me. Why would I do that?" The officer's gaze was unwavering. "Because the world doesn't stop. Threats don't wait for heroes to retire. You can continue saving lives, Captain, not for medals, not for recognition, but because no one else can. Valkyrie is not just a call sign. It's an asset. And assets like you don't come around often." Alina's jaw tightened. The weight of his words pressed on her like gravity. She thought of her cargo flights, of the hundreds of lives she had saved in remote Alaskan towns. She thought of the isolation, the silence, the freedom she had clawed for. And now she was being offered a chance to step back into danger, not because she wanted it, but because the world needed her. She turned her gaze back to the town, watching families huddle together, children shivering in blankets, adults whispering words of thanks she could barely hear over the wind. She had saved them today, alone. She had done what was necessary, and yet deep down she knew the officer was right. Her instincts, her precision, her ability to operate under pressure were still needed. "Do you know what it means?" she finally asked, voice quieter, tinged with both fear and defiance. "To be Valkyrie again, to take lives or save them or risk everything, knowing that the rules don't apply to you because you see things others can't." The officer's eyes met hers, unwavering. "I do. And I also know you can handle it. You already proved it today. You didn't hesitate. You didn't fail. You adapted. You survived. Valkyrie never truly left, Captain Mercer. She's still here. And now the world needs her." For a long moment, Alina said nothing. She considered her life over the past decade. The quiet flights, the anonymity, the ability to make a difference without drawing attention. She thought of her past missions, the danger, the camaraderie, the thrill, and of the cost. Friends lost, trust broken, recognition denied. She had survived, but at the price of leaving the skis she loved. And yet the officer's words lingered, echoing in her mind. The world needs Valkyrie. She felt a familiar pull in her chest, one she had thought she had buried. The pull of the sky, the rush of the engines, the clarity of life-and-death decision-making. Valkyrie had never left. She had only been waiting. Alina Mercer finally exhaled, a mixture of frustration, fear, and resolve. "I'll think about it," she said, not committing, not denying. But even as the words left her lips, she knew the truth. Valkyrie was awake, and the world had just reminded her that she could never truly hide again. The officer nodded, as if he understood everything she could not yet admit aloud. "That's all I ask for now. Just consider it. We'll find a place for Valkyrie where she can continue to save lives, and maybe, just maybe, the world will finally understand what she's capable of." Alina watched him walk away, feeling the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. She returned to the cockpit, staring out at the frozen landscape, knowing that her life, the life she had carefully constructed, was about to change forever. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think like Valkyrie, to remember the instincts, the precision, the power she had once wielded without hesitation. She had left it behind for a reason, but recognition had awakened it. And when Valkyrie awakens, nothing stays the same. Alina Mercer hadn't expected the world to notice. Not yet. She had flown countless missions, saved lives in ways that no one would ever record, and operated in shadows deliberately crafted to keep her invisible. But the F-22 pilots, recognition, and the Air Force officer's visit had disrupted that fragile anonymity. And now, the past she had buried was surfacing in a way she could neither control nor ignore. It began with the media, subtle at first. A local news report covering the storm evacuation mentioned a heroic cargo pilot, a woman who had maneuvered a massive plane through blinding snow to save hundreds. The footage, shaky but undeniable, showed her guiding the C-130 with calm authority, her hands steady on the yoke, her expression unflinching as the blizzard roared outside. The words Captain Alina Mercer flashed on the screen. Then came the emails, the calls, the messages from military contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. "We need to talk," they said. "Urgent debrief." And finally the invitation, or rather the summons from the Pentagon itself. Alina had never wanted recognition. She had never wanted publicity. She had left Top Gun because brilliance in her hands was considered dangerous, because saving lives was not supposed to come with accolades or exposure. And yet, the world was now demanding to know who Valkyrie was. The truth she had buried, the mission that had ended her combat career, was no longer secret. An international investigation had unearthed fragments of classified operations, and reporters pieced together what had happened years ago. The story was explosive. A top pilot, operating outside protocol, making split-second decisions that had prevented international escalation. Her actions had saved hundreds of lives, but in the wrong context, they could have triggered global consequences. Alina sat in a small briefing room at the Pentagon, flanked by military officials and a media liaison. The room buzzed with tension. Her hands rested on the table, fingers intertwined. For years, she had avoided this moment. She had carefully erased herself from the radar. Now, everything was exposed. "Captain Mercer," began the officer across from her, voice controlled, deliberate. "The mission from 12 years ago, the one that led to your resignation. The world knows about it now. Your actions have been declassified and your role is under scrutiny. There are consequences, yes, but also recognition. The public wants to know who Valkyrie is. The world wants to know who you are." She didn't respond immediately. Memories of the mission flooded her. The enemy interceptors closing in, the split-second maneuvers, the decisions that saved her wingman and countless civilians on the ground, the way she had defied orders because orders were not enough. Valkyrie had acted, and in doing so had altered the course of events in ways history might never fully measure. "Do you understand what this means?" the officer pressed. "Your identity, your history, your skill will be public. You'll be recognized not only as a cargo pilot or former Navy pilot, but as Valkyrie, the woman who saved lives in ways most of us couldn't even imagine." Alina's jaw tightened. Recognition had never been her goal. Visibility had never been her choice. She had hidden in Alaska precisely to avoid this moment. And yet, here it was, forced upon her by the world she had long left behind. "I didn't ask for this," she said finally, her voice low, firm. "I saved lives because I had to, not because I wanted fame or medals. Valkyrie isn't a hero. She's a tool, an instrument to act when others can't. That's all, nothing more." The officer's eyes softened, but they didn't waver. "That may be how you see it, but the world will see it differently. They'll see courage, precision, brilliance. They'll see what you've always been capable of, and now they need it." Alina's gaze shifted to the window. Beyond it, the Pentagon grounds were quiet, the wind pushing clouds across the sky. She could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down. The past she had hidden, the skills she had honed in secret, and the life she had tried to live quietly were colliding. Recognition was no longer avoidable. The briefing ended, but the exposure didn't. Within hours, journalists were digging into her history, social media buzzed with speculation, and military analysts dissected every maneuver she had executed in Alaska. The world wanted answers, explanations, context, and Alina Mercer had to provide them, or let someone else tell her story. She returned to her quarters that night, staring at a map of Alaska and the flight paths she had navigated countless times. She thought of the families she had saved, the children she had carried to safety, the villagers who would never know her name. For years, that had been enough. Purpose, without recognition, without attention. But now, the veil had been lifted. Valkyrie could not stay hidden any longer. The first interview request came the next morning. A television network wanted to speak with her live, to ask about the storm evacuation, her history, and the legendary missions from her Top Gun days. She declined initially, retreating into her routine, flying another cargo mission into the frozen wilderness. But as reports proliferated, she realized the truth. The story of Valkyrie was no longer hers to bury. The world had already discovered her. Her co-pilot Derek noticed the tension, the quiet storm inside her. "Captain, everyone's talking about you. The media, the Pentagon, everyone. What do we do?" Alina exhaled, gripping the yoke. "We do what we always do. Focus on the mission. Get people where they need to go. That's all that matters. The rest can wait." But deep down, she knew the rest would not wait. Recognition had a way of forcing action, of exposing truths that had been carefully hidden. The storm outside had been physical, but the storm now was global, public, unavoidable. A week later, a press conference was arranged. Alina stood at the podium, her uniform immaculate, her expression unreadable. Cameras flashed, microphones leaned forward, journalists whispered and murmured. For the first time in years, Valkyrie's name was spoken openly. "Captain Mercer," a reporter began, "can you tell us about your actions during the Alaska evacuation and your history as Valkyrie in Top Gun? How did you manage to perform so precisely under such extreme conditions?" Alina took a deep breath. Her voice, when it came, was steady, calm, and authoritative. "I did what I had to do. My past, my history as Valkyrie, those experiences trained me to act decisively when lives are at stake. Today, my priority was the people on the ground, and that is all it has ever been. Valkyrie is not a legend, a hero, or a myth. Valkyrie is a responsibility, one that I take seriously." The room erupted with questions, the storm of curiosity unstoppable. Reporters asked about her missions, her Top Gun history, her time in Alaska. Every answer she gave was measured, careful, revealing just enough to satisfy while keeping the classified parts buried. Yet every word confirmed one truth: Valkyrie existed, and the world now knew her name. Later, alone in her quarters, Alina reflected on the whirlwind. Recognition had arrived not with fanfare or celebration, but with weight, responsibility, and expectation. The past she had buried, the missions she had hidden, the instincts she had suppressed, all of it had resurfaced. Valkyrie had returned not as a shadow, not as a secret, but as a force acknowledged by the world. She looked out at the night sky, stars peeking through scattered clouds. Somewhere out there, over the frozen wilderness she loved, lives depended on pilots like her. And now, recognition had transformed Valkyrie from a hidden skill into a visible legend. A legend that carried with it obligations, expectations, and dangers she could no longer ignore. The truth had been exposed, and when Valkyrie's truth is revealed, the world can never turn away. The storm had passed, but the aftermath of recognition was only beginning. For Alina Mercer, the quiet life she had built in Alaska, the life of anonymity and quiet heroism, no longer existed. Valkyrie had been revealed, and with that revelation came both expectation and danger. The world had learned of her skills, her missions, and her capacity for split-second decisions that could save or end lives. It started with the calls. The Pentagon, intelligence agencies, even international authorities reached out, all seeking the pilot who had once been classified as too dangerous to fly. They didn't care that she had retired, that she had chosen peace over glory. They needed Valkyrie, and this time she could not hide. Alina stood in the cockpit of her C-130, staring at the horizon. The Alaskan sky stretched out like a canvas of white and blue, a deceptive calm after the storm. She remembered her first flight as Valkyrie, the adrenaline, the instinct, the focus. That young pilot, reckless yet brilliant, had learned lessons in the fire of combat that few could ever imagine. And now, decades later, she would need every ounce of that experience. A secure line rang in her headset. She answered without hesitation. "Captain Mercer," the voice on the other end said, clipped and urgent. "We need you to lead an international evacuation. Hostile conditions. No ground support. Lives are at stake. You're the only pilot qualified for this operation." Alina's hands gripped the controls, her knuckles whitening. She had been called out of obscurity before during the Alaska storm, but this was different. The scale was global. The stakes were unimaginable. Yet beneath the fear and fatigue, a spark ignited, the spark of Valkyrie. "I'll do it," she said, no hesitation, no second thoughts, just the clarity of instinct. Within hours, she was airborne again, a massive transport plane loaded with critical supplies and evacuees, heading into a war-torn region where conditions rivaled the harshest storms she had ever faced. Reports of enemy movements, treacherous weather, and failing infrastructure streamed into her headset. Every variable was a potential disaster. Every second demanded precision, focus, and the courage to act beyond protocol. Her co-pilot Derek had flown with her through Alaska's storms, but this was different. He glanced at her, eyes wide. "Captain, it's worse than anything we've ever dealt with." Alina's gaze was unwavering. "Focus on the controls. Follow my lead. We've trained for worse. Valkyrie doesn't freeze." The skis were a chaotic ballet of cloud and smoke, snow and debris. Enemy aircraft patrolled nearby, drones scanned the terrain, and the evacuees below were counting on her to guide them safely out. Alina's mind worked with mechanical efficiency, calculating speed, altitude, wind currents, and enemy vectors simultaneously. Every instinct honed in Top Gun, every life-or-death decision she had made, converged into a singular purpose: survival. She remembered her first real combat mission decades ago, where she had defied orders to save her wingman and countless civilians. The memory was vivid, the roar of interceptors, missiles screaming past, split-second maneuvers that defied logic but succeeded. The mission had ended her career, grounded her, and forced her into obscurity. But it had also shaped her. Valkyrie had learned to survive against impossible odds. Now she was doing it again. Enemy fire erupted nearby. Missiles streaked past, narrowly missing the massive fuselage. Alina banked sharply, dodging with precision that defied the plane's size. Derek shouted, panic in his voice, but she didn't waver. Every decision was calculated, instinctual, lethal if mishandled, life-saving if executed correctly. "Adjust left by 3 degrees, she commanded, voice calm despite the chaos. "Throttle up, keep steady, eyes on the horizon." Hours passed in tense silence, punctuated by alarms and bursts of static. Each maneuver was a gamble, each choice a razor edge between catastrophe and salvation. But Alina, Valkyrie reborn, guided the plane with flawless precision, every action a testament to decades of unspoken skill. Finally, the evacuees' location appeared through the thick clouds, a makeshift landing zone in the middle of devastation, barely discernible, surrounded by collapsed structures and frozen debris. The winds howled violently, threatening to push the aircraft off course. Derek's hands shook as he checked instruments, but Alina's focus was absolute. "This is it," she said softly. "Brace for landing." The descent was harrowing. Gusts pushed the plane sideways. Ice formed on the wings. Enemy drones hovered nearby, scanning for targets. Every fiber of her being was engaged in the delicate dance between control and chaos. She adjusted the controls, corrected the tilt, banked just enough, slowed the descent without losing stability. The fuselage trembled under the stress, but she held steady. The wheels touched the ground with a jolt, sliding over uneven terrain. Snow and debris erupted around the tires. The evacuees watched in awe and fear as the massive aircraft skidded to a halt, engines screaming against the wind. Alina cut the throttle, killing the engines with deliberate care. Silence fell, heavy and complete, broken only by the howling wind outside. One by one, the evacuees disembarked, shivering, battered, but alive. Mothers clutched children. Elderly citizens held each other tightly. For hundreds of them, Valkyrie's presence had meant survival. And yet, for Alina, there was no triumph, no fanfare, only the quiet satisfaction that lives had been saved. The moment of calm was brief. Reports came in of enemy movement, and the evacuees had to be airlifted to a safer location immediately. She climbed back into the cockpit, engines roaring, adrenaline surging once more. Valkyrie was alive, awake, and fully present. As the plane soared into the sky, Alina allowed herself a rare moment to think of her past, her secret missions, the accolades she had never received, the consequences she had survived. The recognition, once avoided, now surrounded her. She realized it did not diminish Valkyrie, it amplified her purpose. The world could finally see what she was capable of, but it also meant the stakes would only grow higher. By the time the evacuees reached safety, news of the mission had spread globally. Media outlets hailed Valkyrie as a hero. Analysts dissected her maneuvers, comparing them to legendary Top Gun pilots. Governments took note. The Air Force and international allies sought her counsel and expertise. Alina Mercer, the pilot who had hidden in the wilderness for a decade, had been thrust back into the light. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. Valkyrie had returned, not just as a legend, but as a force for good in a world desperately in need of heroes. She had survived storms, recognition, and exposure. She had faced the consequences of her past and emerged stronger. And as the C-130 soared above clouds and mountains, carrying lives saved by her hands, Alina understood the truth she had long avoided. Valkyrie could not be buried. Valkyrie could not be silenced. Valkyrie was not just a name or a call sign, it was her legacy. The storm of life would come again, threats would rise, and dangers would seek to test her. But she was ready. Valkyrie had returned. And this time the world would never forget.